Good evening, everyone. Melinda speaking here. On behalf of FOSI committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight in the 27th FOSI online talk series. I hope you enjoy your dinner and ready to see the presentation. Amid this COVID-19 outbreak situation, hope everybody doing well. Stay at home and keep physical distancing. I would like to extend my gratitude to our sponsor of Noble Energy Resources for funding of this Zoom platform. With us together, if I see on the participants list, the FOSI committee already joining us as well. Mas Ricky is our General Secretary of FOSI, and Pak Win, our advisor, and the rest will joining us soon. With us together, also some of my colleagues and some of the participants already joining, and the rest will joining us soon. So we're glad to inform you that we established the FOSI YouTube channel, and don't forget to subscribe and like the channel, and please enjoy the video. Today's talk will be uploaded as well. So the committee is always trying to keep the consistency in organizing this online talk series that we can learn together through this platform. Therefore, we are more than happy for feedback and suggestion. I would like to thank you for joining us. Get ready to be excited for a while. The topic will be how to approach shale resource plays. The registered participants is about 100. And moving right along, it is now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Really honored to have Mr. Ali Jaffri, Ph.D. Currently, he is a CEO at Applied Stratigraphic. Let me introduce himself a little bit. So Ali Jaffri, Ph.D. is the founder of Applied Stratigraphic LLC and has 21 years of experience in sedimentology and stratigraphy projects. He has worked for several onshore U.S. basin, North Sea, Indus Basin, Barents Sea, offshore East and West Africa, Taranaki Basin, offshore mid-Norway, and former Soviet Union. He has a doctorate from Colorado State, master's from Oklahoma State, and bachelor's from University of Colorado. Equally proficient in carbonates and plastics, he has trained over 500 oil and gas professionals from 56 companies in 10 countries. So thank you very much and many thanks for sparing your time this evening, Mr. Ali Jaffri. Well, before I hand over to our guest speaker, as usual, please allow me to give you some rules in order to make this meeting running smoothly. I would like to get your attention for a moment. First, I recommend to all participants to mute the audio and switch off your video during explanation from presenter to maintain good connection. Second, the presentation may be recorded for rescreening within the FOSI platforms. Third, a Q&A box can be found in the icon panels, usually at the bottom of your screen. Please enter your name. Later on, my colleague Mas Ricky will collect after the presentation. It will be answered live. Later, you might turn on your audio or video to deliver your question. So this is a very flexible for discussion. So the session later on, let we see how it goes and how many questions arises. If you don't mind, we will have a break. If so many questions arises, then we can have a break in the middle of the presentation. So, well, ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy the talk and please welcome Mr. Ali Jaffri. This is your turn.
All right, thank you so much, Melinda. I appreciate the introduction. And it's a great honor for me to be doing this for FOSI. And I've seen you guys' page on LinkedIn. I follow it, and you guys do excellent work. I also want to thank you, Mr. Ricky Tampubulan, for arranging this. It's again, I'm very honored to be doing this for you. So today we'll talk about how to approach shale reservoirs. But before that, I just wanted to tell you guys a little bit about who we are and what we do. I run this company called Applied Stratigraphics. We do sedimentology and sequence stratigraphy out of Denver. You can see I've got a very small team, but even though the team is small, everyone I have is highly qualified, and I've got 2 different shale experts on my team. Melinda has very kindly already introduced me, and this is what I do. I do full-time sedimentology and sequence stratigraphy consulting and training, and we do it across the world. And when I say we do it across the world, it's literally basins spread all over. Now, as far as shales go, what I've done is I've highlighted the shales that I've personally worked on here in case you have questions about, about specifics. This includes the Mancos, the Monterey, the Bakken, the Niobrara, the Barnett, which is the very first one to have started in the US. And I was very lucky in the sense that right when people were getting into the Barnett Shale, I got an internship working for ExxonMobil's research labs in Houston. And while they were developing the first sequence stratigraphic models for shale, I was involved in that process. And then I've worked the Bone Spring, Avalon, and Wolfcamp in the Permian Basin, the Mowry. So quite a few shales in the US. I've also been very fortunate to have visited Indonesia for training purposes for 3 different times. In Indonesia, we partner up with this company called PT Geoservices. Here you can see me back in the day when oil prices were high and I was young and good looking. And then oil prices crashed in 2015 and then they crashed again this year. And now this is what I look like, unfortunately. So in Indonesia, we do a lot of cool things. We do carbonate courses with modern carbonate field trips to Lembangan Island near Bali. And then we also do modern clastic field trips, which is the 5th day of a course on fluvial and shallow marine clastic reservoirs. Again, through PT Geoservices, we go out there, look at different environments of deposition. And I tell, of all the places I've visited in the world, Indonesia is definitely my favorite. And I'm not saying it because this is an Indonesian platform. I think the people are extremely friendly. They're always smiling. I don't know what you guys eat that makes you smile. I think the food is so amazing. That's why you guys are smiling all the time. But, just fantastic place to be. And I was supposed to go teach there again. I had 5 courses scheduled in Indonesia this year. And unfortunately, because of COVID-19, they got canceled. But hopefully next year, I'll get an opportunity to go back again. So with that, let's talk about shale a little bit, and then we're going to talk about the approach that we have developed at Applied Stratigraphics for going after them. So the very first thing is that we have to break certain stereotypes. When I went to college back in the Cretaceous, I was told that shale, by definition, is a black, organic, rich rock, which is fissile. And that is what stuck in my head. I was like, okay, that's what shale is supposed to look like. So when you go to the outcrop, when you're looking at this black stuff that breaks up very easily, you're like, oh, that's shale. And that's true. This one is a prodeltaic shale called a Manco shale. Here's another prodeltaic shale called a Mowry shale, which is in the Powder River Basin. But that is our impression of what shale should look like. And that's dangerous. It's dangerous because what we are producing oil and gas from in the US is from a very large diversity of rocks. And all of them have fallen into this umbrella of shale. For example, if you look at this doesn't look like that shale that we learn about at the university level, okay? It's not black. It's certainly not fissile. You can see that it's highly deformed. You can see these large chert beds in there. And it's 100% carbonate. But people still call it the Bone Spring Shale in the US. And this is one of the largest oil producers in the US right now. So you can see it looks nothing like that shale that we have in our mind. So the first thing I'm going to start with is a classification, because I think it's very important for all of us to be on the same page. So there's many classification schemes out there. This is a classification scheme I've personally modified. This is what we use company-wide and for our clients. So this was first created by Peter and Dana Scholey, very smart people, carbonate experts. And the way they've classified shale is it's a ternary plot. So you've got 100% clay, 100% quartz, and 100% carbonate up here. And then the most important part on this scheme is, first of all, shale is described as something which is finer than 62 microns in size. And when you look in here, If it is 100% carbonate, we call it a calcareous mudstone. Now, what I've done to modify this is I've added terms that we are used to hearing. Like, I'm sure if you're working in oil and gas, you've heard the term marl. So what exactly is marl? Marl is a mud rock, which is the term that we prefer using instead of using the term shale. It is a mud rock, which is 30 to 60% calcium carbonate. If it's greater than 70% calcium carbonate, it is chalk, and this is where it occurs. The most important thing on this ternary plot that I want you to get is this orange line right here. This is the brittle ductile transition zone. What does that mean? What that means is everything on this side can actually naturally fracture, okay? It is brittle enough that it naturally fractures. But once you get into this zone, you have such high clay percentage, we're getting into about, it starts at around 40% clay and goes to about 60% clay. In that zone, we are increasing clay content to such a degree that the rock can no longer fracture in nature. And guess what? When we try to hydraulically fracture it, it's not going to hydraulically fracture. Why? Because it has too much clay in it. And on this ternary plot of mud rocks, this is where real shale is. So it's kind of ironic in the sense that in the US, we call everything a shale. We're like, oh, this is the Barnett Shale, the Utica Shale, the Marcellus Shale. But in reality, the actual shale is too ductile to be naturally fractured and actually be a good reservoir. So on this side, what the Shoalies have done is they have actually plotted all the different kinds of mud rocks that are producing in the US and some of those that are overseas, like the Vaca Muerta, which is in Argentina. It's very famous right now. That's on here. The chalks of the North Sea are on here. And then a lot of the very famous Canadian shales like the Montney, that's on there as well. So you can see that it's a very wide distribution, except this little corner, which is the actual shale, okay? That is not producing. Why? Because all the production that's coming from these units, they have to have natural fractures, and then we should be able to artificially or hydraulically fracture these. The other thing that I'd like to talk about very quickly is this idea that whenever people say shale, they're talking about, they always say, oh, the US shale gas plays. Oh, we're going to work on shale gas. I want us to be very, very clear that it is not necessary for shale to only produce gas. In fact, shale can produce oil as well. In fact, right now, the largest shale reservoirs are actually oil producing from the Permian Basin. Okay, so on here, I've listed all the shales that are producing oil, and then on here, you have all the shale that is actually producing gas. So you shouldn't assume that shale is only going to produce gas. It can produce just as much oil. Going with that, there's two definitions that people always get confused about, which is oil shale versus shale oil. Shale oil is what I showed you on the previous slide right here, okay? Whereas oil shale is something we actually mine. We don't drill into oil shale. We mine it, then it has to be heated. And once it's heated, then it starts giving off hydrocarbons, okay? All right. Hopefully that has changed your impression. Like mud rocks, they have quite a bit of diversity. Now, when you open your mind, you will see opportunities everywhere. This is a seismic line from the Permian Basin in the US, okay, during Wolfcamp time. And one of the biggest oil producers in the US right now is the Wolfcamp Formation in the Permian Basin. And what is it producing from? It's not clastic, it's actually carbonate. And it is the most distal expression of a rimmed attached platform. So you can see here's the shelf. This is where the rim used to be, or at that time, it was actually a distally steepened ramp. And then this is where all those shales were deposited as a series of sediment gravity flows. So you're like, well, wait a minute. We have carbonate platforms in Indonesia, okay? So if we have carbonate platforms in Indonesia, this example is from Pakistan, then if we go out here in a basinal setting, should we expect to find organic rich carbonates, fine-grained carbonates that could possibly have unconventional resource play potential? And the answer is, well, it depends. It depends on what the age is, and we're going to get into that. But the fact is, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to get out of that mind frame that, oh, shale has to be clastic, it has to be pro-deltaic. Some of the biggest producers in the US are actually all carbonates. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, if you talk to different shale people, they all have different approaches. This is from Dan Jaffri, who is a genius. He's a very brilliant shale geochemist, and a lot of his presentations can be found on YouTube. So if you just Google Dan Jaffri, you'll get a bunch of his YouTube presentations. And then this is his approach at coming at shale. He can, there's things that he thinks are a critical need, things that are manageable need, and so on. There's a more simplistic approach that was given by David Waldo, which is, he says when you're approaching shale, you should have a complete understanding of the resource and then a full utilization of the technology. And it has to be a marriage of those two for this to work. Now, this is my own approach to shale, and I've given you 10 different steps. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through those 10 different steps, and then we'll talk about what all you should be doing. Now, step 1 right here is that you do steps 1 through 9 in integrated teams. This is extremely, extremely important. Usually, let's assume I go to an oil and gas company anywhere in the world, and let's assume they are working on a deep water turbidite. The geologists are working by themselves. Sometimes they'll talk to the geophysicists when they're looking at seismic, but they make all the decisions themselves. They make a depth map, a structure map. They figure out what the net to gross down there is going to be. Once they have everything figured out, that is when they go to the engineers. And then the engineers decide, okay, how do they want to drill that well, what the target is, all that good stuff. But the geologist almost never talks to the land people. Okay, that almost never happens when you're looking at conventional oil and gas plays. But shales are very different in the sense that everyone has to be involved from day one. Okay, just because of the way the operation works. I'll tell you a quick story about this. There's a consultant from the US. He goes down to Saudi Arabia, and they're very interested in unconventional resource plays down there. And everything was good to go. And they're like, okay, well, what are we going to do about frac sand? And the Saudis started laughing. They're like, hey, you know what? We're in Saudi Arabia. There's definitely no shortage of sand here. And they're like, well, no, because the sand that you have is not going to work for this particular, to be injected as proppant. It's just not going to work. So then they were like, well, wait a minute. That's something we didn't even plan for. Well, it has to be planned from the very beginning. Okay, so in fact, in the US, a lot of times they call these shale plays, they call them engineering plays, just because of the involvement of engineers from the very start. Okay, so you have to do this in an integrated team. This is not something the geologist does, then passes it on to the engineers and the land people. Everything has to be done together from scratch. So as far as technical stuff goes, what is the first thing you should do? Well, the first thing I would recommend, especially if you are new to this in your country, is look for source rocks, especially basinal carbonates. In most countries, this has already been done. Okay, so if you've got, let's assume in Indonesia, if you're drilling these carbonate platforms, or you're drilling these deep water turbidites or these deltaic sandstones, you already know what the source rocks are for those conventional reservoirs. So the first logical step would be to go look at those source rocks. Okay, would those have unconventional resource play potential? That is the first step. When you are looking at source rocks, something which is extremely important when it comes to resource plays is the age. Okay, why is that? Well, if you look at, here's a geologic time scale, and what I've done is I've drawn arrows along some of the most prolific unconventional resource plays in the US right now. And what you notice is that most of them are older than the Jurassic. Well, why is that? Well, what happened is in Jurassic, we had the evolution of calcareous nanoplankton. And what happens with calcareous nanoplankton is that they dilute pelagic deposits. Okay, there's so many of those that are dying and their calcareous shells are settling on the seafloor that they dilute the organic content of these pelagic deposits, which is not a good thing. Okay, so yes, there are a few unconventional resource plays associated with the Cretaceous, but the majority of these are from rocks that were deposited as in a pelagic setting or a hemipelagic setting before the evolution of calcareous nanoplankton, so back there. So age is extremely important when you are looking at these. So let's assume you have a list of source rocks in Indonesia. Go for the ones that are older than the Jurassic. Well, what's the next step? Well, the next step is look for ocean anoxic events in your basin. These have occurred throughout geologic time. They're highly concentrated in the Cretaceous. These are periods in the Earth's history where the oceans became extremely anoxic. That was a good thing. Why? Because the more anoxic the oceans are, the less the bacterial activity is the bacteria that decompose organic matter on the seafloor. And when you decrease the number of bacteria, you increase the chances of preserving organic matter. And then you have better, higher quality source rocks. So I've listed some of these ocean anoxic events for you right here. And that would be something good to look at. Now, the next thing is you apply certain geochemical parameters, you apply some filters. Now, a lot of countries, what they did was a few years ago, about 10, 15 years ago, the Energy Information Agency in the US did a global survey. They didn't do a global survey, but they put out a report which ranked countries on the basis of shale oil and gas potential. And when the EIA was doing this, this was from samples they had collected years ago, the cutoff that they put on there was a 2% cutoff, which is the traditional cutoff for source rocks. They're like, okay, a source rock must have greater than 2% TOC in order for it to generate hydrocarbons. But I'll tell you what, a lot of potential mud rock reservoirs were thrown out because of this 2% cutoff. What I'm going to tell you right now is you could even have a TOC of 1%, maybe even 0.5%, and it would still have unconventional resource play potential. It is not about the percentage of TOC, but what kind of TOC you're looking at. Here's an example. Both of these rocks have the exact same TOC, but this one has a lot more reactive carbon, and this one has a lot more inert carbon. This one would be a good source. This one would be a poor source. So it is not a matter of what the TOC is like. It's a matter of what kind of TOC. So if someone tells you that, oh my, this rock has 12% TOC, you shouldn't already assume that, oh my God, if it's got 12% TOC, this is going to have extremely good unconventional resource play potential, because it may have a lot of inert carbon. Okay, so that's again something to keep in mind. Now, this slide in here, I just put that in there for your reference. This is again from Dan Jarvie's presentation. This is all the risk factors, all the way he evaluates source rocks. I'm not a geochemist. I'm not going to go through this with you, and we don't have time to go through this with you. But again, I've put this in here for you because I want you to know that a lot of work has already been done on the evaluation of these unconventional resource plays. So when you if this is something you're interested in, I would strongly urge you to go look at Dan Jarvie's talks or read his papers where he discusses all these things in a lot of details. What I will tell you is there's no single geochemistry test which is a smoking gun. So some people are like, well, you know what? If we'll do pyrolysis and we come up with this S1 and S2 curves and we can put it in this formula, that'll tell us what the best way to do this is. Others will give you, no, hydrogen index is the best thing to look at. No, there's not a single test that you can do. So a lot of times what people will do is they will, in here, for example, I think one of the things they did was vitrinite reflectance. And they're like, oh, we're just going to use that as an evaluation. please do not go with just one test. You have to go with multiple geochemistry tests in order to determine what the potential is. Now, the next step is finding the right structural configuration. What is the right structural configuration? Well, it's a combination, okay? Extensional regimes tend to be better. Simple structures, when I say simple structures, if you've seen seismic lines from the Iranian Zagros fold and thrust belts, those are ridiculous. Okay, so you've got thrust upon thrust and everything is all jumbled up. Now we want to stay away from things like that. You know, very gentle structures like maybe like a monocline are good. Even if there's no structure that's, you know, or a very subtle structure that's even better. Large lineaments, a general lack of faults, and generally compressional regimes are not conducive to open fracture networks. Okay, so it's a combination of all of these. There is no single smoking gun. Now, fractures are key. Why are fractures so important? Well, because these rocks have such low porosity and permeability. We're talking about porosities less than 10%. We're talking about permeabilities in the nano-Darcy range, not even in the micro-Darcy range. So in order for this to flow, we need natural fractures. And once you have natural fractures, then you hydraulically fracture it so the natural fracture networks can connect with your hydraulic fractures, and then fluids or gas can start flowing. So it's extremely important that you characterize the fractures. So here's an example. This is from the Niobrara Formation, which is in Denver, which is around Colorado and in parts of Wyoming. The first thing you have to do is when you see a fracture, is it natural or is it induced? Because drilling can also produce fractures. Core handling can produce fractures. So you need to be able to look at the core and determine whether the fracture is natural or induced, whether they are tension fractures or shear fractures. Are they conductive to fluids migrating across the fracture plane? You can get features along fracture planes that are good. For example, slick and crysts. You know, again, we don't have time to talk about a lot of these things, but again, if you are going to be working unconventional resource plays, you really, really need to increase your understanding of natural fracture systems and how to describe them. Okay, I cannot stress that enough. Now, the next thing is the sedimentology of these systems. Back in the day, again, back in the Cretaceous, when I was in college, I was told that shale forms in a pelagic setting, and it forms these drapes that are laterally continuous. I'm like, okay, easy enough. So in my mind, and in most people's minds who went to school at the same time that I did, shale was supposed to be totally homogeneous with very little change. But now we realize that, first of all, most of these shale plays, if you look at their sedimentology, they are not pelagic. Most of those were deposited either by storm currents or by sediment gravity flows like turbidites and debrites, and a combination of those. What you're seeing here is a photo of the Avalon Shale, which is from the Permian Basin. And you can see floating clasts in there. You can see convoluted lamination. Okay, this thing is a jumbled up mess. Why? Because it is most likely a debrite, a product of a debris flow that came down this distally steepened ramp and got deposited. Here's an outcrop of some of these basinal shale, or I like to call them mud rocks. And what you're looking at are these lens-like shapes. And what I want you to picture are these lobes. You know, just like you see lobes, sandstone lobes, in like turbiditic sandstone lobes. That's what you've got right here. In this case, they happen to be debritic, but these are coming out towards you, and then we've taken a cross-section across them. So here's one lobe right here. Here's the lobe axis. Those are the fringes. Here's the lobe axis, fringes. So these things have a distinct shape. They're not laterally continuous blankets. Okay, in a deep water setting, they may be lobate or channel-like. In fact, some of the cores that I've recently looked at from the Wolfcamp show facies that look like external levees. So again, these things can have a lot of different shapes and geometries. So this is my personal specialization, which is sequence stratigraphy. So I'll give you a few slides about that before we move on. When you're doing sequence stratigraphy in shale, it's very different than sequence stratigraphy in conventional resource plays. Usually, unfortunately, even in the US, a lot of times what people will do is they'll just come up with these benches, this layer cake stratigraphy for shales. They, again, are assuming that all the layers are laterally continuous, and they'll give them a name like Wolfcamp A, Wolfcamp B, Wolfcamp C, or the first bone spring, the second bone spring, the third bone spring. In reality, they are a collection of sediment gravity flows. So turbidite comes in, deposits a lobe. Then debrite comes in, deposits a lobe. Then this whole slope collapses, and you get a mass transport deposit that comes on top. The mass transport deposit has topography on top of it, and that topography is now going to control additional sediment gravity flows that are coming in. And when you're done, it looks more like this. It is not layer cake. Okay, so this concept of layer cake stratigraphy rarely works in these shales. The other thing you should know is that the sequence stratigraphy that you and I learn in college, or even the sequence stratigraphy that I usually teach when I do these international courses, which is, all right, guys, let's look for on lap, down lap, top lap, all this Exxon style seismic stratigraphy stuff, it does not work for shale. Why? Why is that? Because two reasons. First of all, most of these shale plays are so thin that on seismic, at best, they're represented by two reflections. So at two reflections, no, you're not going to see on lap and down lap and top lap and all that jazz. And secondly, most of them are, as far as their impedance goes, you're not getting sandstone shale or limestone shale. The impedance contrast is not sufficient for you to actually get reflections in there. So this whole notion that we usually apply to conventional resource plays does not work with shales. So what are we doing sequence stratigraphy wise? Well, it's fairly simple. I'll give you a quick example. One of the problems which is associated with a lot of these shales is stuck pipe. Okay, so why do we get stuck pipe? Okay, well, what happens is you're drilling a well, you go through a layer which is extremely clay rich. Okay, when those clays absorb water, they swell up, and then they start breaking up. Okay, so here they start breaking up, and all these pieces are going to go down, and that is what gets the pipe stuck. Well, that's a pain in the neck, and we don't want to deal with it. So how do we go around it? Well, sequence stratigraphy allows us to predict where the most clay-rich intervals are going to be. For example, in the Eagle Ford, people were drilling a lot of these. They were landing these wells. When I say landing, where the vertical part goes into the horizontal part. They were landing these wells in the maximum flooding interval, which is the condensed section, and then they were getting problems with stuck pipe. So, some of the consultants that were working on this suggested that, hey, instead of landing it in the condensed section, which of course has the highest TOC and the right TOC, why don't you land it a little bit higher in the high stand systems tract? And by doing so, you avoid a lot of those clays. And they started doing that, and then they got around the stuck pipe problem. So again, sequence stratigraphy in shale plays is not about going and finding this, hundreds of $1,000 barrel per day well. We're not going after these giant channel levee systems in a place like exotic, like West Africa, and drilling $130 million wells. It's about finding slightly more oil-rich or gas-rich zone. It's all about finding the sweet spot. Okay, so your sequence stratigraphy has to be tied to fractures. So you're trying to predict facies that you think are going to be more ductile versus facies that are going to be more brittle. Okay, now when you do this, a very useful tool, instead of using the traditional gamma ray curve that we use, because the traditional gamma ray curve that we use is reading uranium, potassium, and thorium. Okay, a smart thing to do with these resource plays is actually to use a spectral gamma ray, in which We have separate curves for uranium, potassium, because uranium and potassium is often corresponds with high clay, whereas uranium alone corresponds with high TOC. Okay, so that's something you could do. Now I'm going to show you a very quick example. This is from the Wolfkamp. Again, just to show you why sequence stratigraphy is important, because these things changed laterally quite a bit. So the data I'm about to show you was generously donated by borehole image specialists. These guys are consultants that are based in Denver, and they were nice enough to share some of their data so I could show this to you. So these are two wells in the Permian Basin. They're only 3 miles apart. That's very important. They're only 3 miles apart, so they're super close. The second thing you need to know is that they have the exact same trend. And if they have the exact same trend, you would expect them to be intersecting the same types of fractures, okay? So these are the results from the first well. The first well intersected 731 fractures, and they were uniformly distributed. 986 deformed beds. So these are beds that are not horizontal, that have been deformed for some reason. And this well had a higher gas to oil ratio. Now we look at the other well, which is only 3 miles apart. This one has 2,059 wells. Okay, oh, sorry, 2,059 fractures. So you can see there is a drastic difference in the number of fractures that this one intersected. Same trend, only 3 miles apart. And 187 deformed beds. Okay, this one had 986 deformed beds. And then this one has a lower gas to oil ratio. Again, what I'm trying to show you is this whole idea that, oh, these shales are going to be totally homogeneous, same reservoir properties everywhere, same petrophysical properties everywhere. That is just not true. Okay, these things change quite a bit. So so step number 7, when you're approaching these, I cannot stress this enough because I've seen this happen quite a few times with clients of mine who didn't consult us for shale. They were, they decided to do the shale stuff on their own. And there was a lot of talk about, oh, we're going to drill the first pilot horizontal well in this area. Well, guys, think about it this way. I've showed you how much these things change within just 3 miles. Now, if you've got an entire basin and you decide to put your horizontal right here, well, guess what? The results of that horizontal well over here may be drastically different from the middle part of your basin, or this part of your basin, or that part of your basin. So instead of going after putting a horizontal in one part of the basin, what I recommend is going after 5 vertical wells in different parts of the basin, because the cost of drilling one horizontal well roughly equals the cost of 5 vertical wells. Okay, so instead of going for one spot, try to get as much diversity in sedimentary facies as you can and fracture types as you can by drilling them in different parts of the basin. Also, when you're going to do this, and if you want this to be economic, you have to keep this in mind. Your mud rock needs to be between 50 to 100 feet thick. If it's thinner than that, you're going to run into problems for it being economic. Now, this is the part, when remember in the beginning I said you must get the land people involved. You must get the engineers involved. One of the things people know that, oh yeah, hydraulic fracturing, that's important. It has to be done. Well, man, do you have any idea just how much water or how much sand we are actually putting into one of these wells? I like to show this picture just to give people a mental image. You can see that here's a train, and this train is carrying these railroad carts full of coal. It takes 100 of these carts filled with sand for the completion of a single well. That is how much sand we need. And when I say sand, I don't mean you could just go to the beach in front of Jakarta and just scoop up some sand and be like, all right, this is the sand we're going to use. No, that is not how it works. The sand needs to be a certain mineralogy. The sand needs to be a certain grain size, which people call mesh size in these resource plays. So it just can't be any sand. It has to be a specific type of sand. In fact, believe it or not, a lot of these companies in the US that are very successful with drilling these unconventional resource plays, they actually own their own sand mines. They figured out where the good sand is, and instead of buying sand from someone else, they decided to go after these places, buy that area, and they mine their own sand just to be able to inject that into these wells. So that's the sand issue. You have to keep that in mind. The second thing is they take tons of water, depending on how long the lateral happens to be. Now, the 1/4 of the water that is pumped actually comes back to the surface. Now, you have to remember that this water has chemicals, certain chemicals that have mixed into that, okay? Because we send a certain solution in there. We used to use gel. We've now switched to slick water, but it does have a certain chemistry. It's not water that you can just let out onto someone's rice field, okay? Because it's going to ruin it. So where does all that water go? What do you do with all that excess water that is being produced from these fracking operations? It has to be taken care of. Again, this is such a big deal in the US that there are certain research institutions like the BEG that are just focused on, well, where do we put this disposal water? So now they're thinking about formations that they could inject that water in a safe manner, environmentally friendly manner. All right, step number 9. Now this is you may look at this and you're like, well, he's just saying this because he's giving us this presentation from the US. But you have to import the right technology from the right spot. There's a country I do a lot of dealing. I've had clients in for a very long time, and someone contacted me from there. This is about 5-6 years ago, and they're like, hey, you know what? We are getting into drilling shale wells. We need some expertise. And so I gave them a list of some of the top shale experts in the US. And they decided to go with a company from the UK instead. And, I thought about it, and I asked this person, I said, how many shale wells are being drilled in the UK right now? And the answer is 0. So why would you get expertise from a country where they're not even drilling shale wells? That's a silly idea, right? Okay, so the US is where this technology was first developed. It has been refined over and over again. The Canadians are not far behind. The Canadians are drilling a lot of unconventional resource plays as well. But you have to get the right expertise to come help you out instead of trying to figure this out on your own. Why should you do this? Well, first of all, it saves you time. For example, in a lot of these places, they're trying to use Archie's equation to do shale petrophysics. Archie's equation does not work for shale petrophysics. It saves you money because we've tried things in the US that used to work, and then we found better things. For example, guar was a huge thing. This is a plant, and they used guar-based gels to put proppant into these wells. We no longer do that. It focuses your efforts. So if someone who has worked on multiple shale plays comes in, then they'll be like, okay, maybe you need to focus on this and that, especially in a place like Indonesia where you've got varying thermal gradients. Okay. Here's a graph which again shows you what the shale revolution and its effects. To me, there's been multiple revolutions. The biggest one of the biggest technology revolutions that I've personally seen was in 2000, at the end of 2014, at the beginning of 2015. So I want you to look at this. Look at the rig count. So the rig count dropped significantly. Okay, but while the rig count is dropping, what about oil production? The oil production is actually increasing. You're like, well, that does not make sense. How do you have less rigs and get more oil? Well, what happened right here is when Saudi decided to increase their oil production back in 2000, at the end of 2014, at the beginning 2015, and they caused a global oil crash. So what did the shale producers in the US do? The idea was to crush the US shale industry, but instead of them being crushed, they're like, okay, how can we do things cheaper? How can we be more efficient at the way we do things? And technology took a huge leap at that point. In fact, personally, when I have to read papers, if I'm trying to read a paper about fracking or well design or anything like that, I don't even read papers that are older than 2014 because I'm pretty sure that the technology that we're using back then will no longer be eligible at this time. Finally, the last step I highly recommend is making empirical correlations. Here's an example from this guy. They're working on the US East Coast on the Appalachian Basin. He was working on the Marcellus Shale. They were just not doing well. They're like, you know what? The wells are okay. They're not really producing that well. So then he goes and visits a friend of his who was drilling wells in the Barnett. And then he realizes, like, well, wait a minute. The Barnett and the Marcellus are very similar in the sense that you've got a lower shale rich unit and upper shale rich unit with a limestone in the middle. And by looking at, by comparing the two and where the best wells are, they came back to the Marcellus, and the Marcellus became such a hit that right now it's one of the top US shale plays. It surpassed the Barnett. So why am I showing you this? Well, the reason I'm showing you this is because let's assume you find a shale play in Indonesia compared with something that's already been drilled in the US. Go over the geology data, the engineering data, and then figure out if you can make it work in your own country. So the last one I'm going to leave you with is something which is very different. Okay, this one is not pre-Jurassic. This is actually Miocene in age. This is the Monterey Shale. I used to work this when I used to work for Chevron in California. It contains heavy oil, naturally fractured reservoir, and the whole thing is made up of diatomite. Okay, so it's very, very different. It's not clay rich. It's not calcareous. The whole thing is super silica rich. And it's a huff and puff, heavy oil operation. You inject steam for 72 hours. Then you open up your production wells for 24 hours, injection wells for 72 hours again. So that's what you do. But again, a lot of shale plays, a lot of diversity for you to learn this stuff from. So like I said, many approaches out there. This one was mine. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please, you can follow us on LinkedIn. We are posting stuff all the time. We have our LinkedIn groups. We put articles on there. We have our YouTube channel. We even have a Facebook. So I hope you found this useful. And at this point, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take those.
Thank you very much, Ali. Very nice presentation. Actually, I'm very inspired by your LinkedIn posts. You usually post every new stuff in your LinkedIn, and I'm really happy to see it. Now right, we are moving to the question sessions. Still empty currently, but you can put your name here in the chat box if you want to have a question with Ali about the shale gas, because it's very interesting topic. Because currently Indonesia want to develop also shale gas play, unconventional play in Indonesia, and mostly as far as I know, our source rock is very different because we have mostly in Western Indonesia. We divide Indonesia but based on two.
Age is matter. Let's say that we have in Indonesia that the moderator said before that our source rock is come from Cenozoic age, so it's a lot of younger from your US source rock. What does it matter too much for you? Is it because the maturity, or is it because ductile, or what? Thank you.
Okay, that's an excellent question. So two things I want to show you real quick. The first thing is I want you to look at this. Here on this geologic time scale, you can see right at the Paleocene-Eocene boundary, right there was an ocean anoxic event. Okay, now what does that tell you? What that tells you that even in your data, like I said, you said it's Cenozoic in age, there is potential to have extremely high TOC. That is the first thing. Now, if this is a proven source rock, which it is in your case, then in this case, if it's a proven source rock, this means it is already mature. So that is not a problem as well. So what should you be looking at? I think the next step for you to be looking at this particular shale is, first of all, look how thick it is. Is it at least 50 to 100 feet thick? The next part would be, what is the clay content of that shale? Because I can tell you already that the clay content of it will vary significantly. And clay is poison. Clay is poison for these unconventional resource plays for multiple reasons. So you'll have to look at it, and then you will have to find the most silica-rich parts within that source rock, okay? Because the more silica it has, the more brittle it can be, and then it can take fractures in there. So I would say just because 90% of these shale plays, successful shale plays in the US are pre-Jurassic, does not mean that it is impossible for you to have a Cenozoic resource play that works. It's just that you'd have to go through a lot of different tests to prove it. And just like this one is Miocene in age, but it works fantastic. I hope that answers your question.
Okay.
So you have example for the shale production from tertiary shale, right?
Yes, we do. So this is what I would recommend is reading about the Miocene Monterey Shale in the U.S.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Next question from Henry, Henry Horace. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi,
Yeah,
Ali. Nice presentation. Thank you. Met you in Golden in 2018, actually. Just a quick question. Any talk about the Green River Formation as the shale unconventional? Because I think that is the most quite reliable shale to be compared with Indonesia, since we are dominated by lacustrine shale. I mean, any share about that?
You know, Andrew, first of all, I remember you. We were in Paul Weimer's class together.
Oh, really?
Yeah. If you were at the School of Mines, right?
No, that is Henrico's, not me. I think he's
okay. I'm confusing you. Okay. That makes sense. All right. So, so yes, as far as the Green River Formation goes, I actually had a picture in the presentation of the Green River Formation. This is a lacustrine, very, very high TOC shale, except that this happens to be oil shale and not shale oil. So it is not cooked enough. It is not mature enough. So if you look at these hills, here's my car for scale. There's more oil in these hills in Colorado in the Green River Formation than there is in Saudi Arabia, except that it's just not economic. It has to be heated up. In fact, ExxonMobil had this secret project for many, many, many years where they actually put these rods into the ground, and they were gonna, or I don't even know what the mechanism was, to be honest. I made the stuff up with the rod, but they were doing something to heat this thing up in situ to see if they could liberate hydrocarbons. But you know what? You just need exceedingly high oil prices for that to be economic. So right now, even the oil sands in Canada, they're just not economic right now. So it's that's kind of where it's at right now. I think oil prices would need to be over $150 a barrel, if not higher, for this to be economic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the potential is there. It's just not economic right now.
Okay. Thanks, Ali. Just additional comment actually. And then what do you think about the brittleness? Since we are in the we are mostly in the freshwater lacustrine, maybe more smectite, more clay than the
that is
Green
also
River.
That's a very, very good point. The Green River is fairly unique in the sense that not only is it extremely clay rich, it is actually very evaporite rich. And the problem, evaporites and fractures just don't work well together because the evaporites tend to plug up natural fracture systems, which is again not very conducive. There are parts of the Green River where there's quite a few lacustrine deltas that connect into it, and they introduce quite a bit of silica into the system. But that's along the periphery of the lake where you don't have some of the most organic rich facies. So I think, again, when they do work on it, they'd have to find a sweet spot where you have high TOC, the right TOC. It is all right TOC because it's type 1. But then you would need to have enough silica for you to be actually able to frack it.
Okay.
Thanks, Ali.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Next question from, Mas Kartiko, ya. Yeah. Mas Kartiko.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ali. Good presentation.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask about that you say that you need a lot of sand to produce the shale gas or oil. It is to make a fracture to open the shale, so we can get extra fracture to produce, or?
You know what? Let me show you something real quick, because that is, again, that's a very good question. Okay, so let's do this. All right, so this is our hydraulic fracture that is traveling into this rock. Okay, now what happens is, because of pressure, because of lithostatic pressure, these fractures want to close back up right after you've opened them. So to prevent them from closing back up, we need to put something that keeps the fracture open, okay? And that is what we call proppant. And that is the reason why we need so much sand, because that sand needs to be injected into these, and that sand prevents those fractures from annealing. Okay, that's why we need it. And now you can obviously see, let's assume I went to the beach in Bali and I collected a bunch of sand and I put that in there. Well, what is that sand made up of? Well, most of the sand on the beaches in Bali is made up of these tiny foraminifera, these benthic foraminifera. So if I put those in there, those are pretty much hollow. It's going to be crushed. Okay, but that sand will not be able to hold that fracture open. So that sand cannot be calcareous. It needs to be silica rich, or sometimes they make artificial sand. They're called ceramics, and you can put those in there. But it has to be the correct size of sand and the correct consistency of sand for this thing not to come back up. And that is why we need so much.
And the price, you said that one well is 4 million for one well. Is that including the sand also, or it's just to make a hole?
That is just to make the hole. So just the drilling cost would be around 4 million. And then to complete the well, which includes the hydraulic fracking, would be another 4 million.
Okay, so around 8 million, yeah,
around 8 million
for one well.
Yes, sir.
And how much you can produce with one well? 8 million. That one.
You know what? That totally depends. You know, it completely depends on where you're producing them. You know, so for example, you know, if you're in the Wolf Camp, it's going to have a very different IP versus the Haynesville versus somewhere else. But yeah, it varies significantly, is what I'm trying to say. So unfortunately there's not a single number that I can give you. But the one thing I will tell you though is, unlike conventional resource plays, where, you know, if you plot production for a conventional well in Indonesia that's producing from a carbonate or a turbidite, the production profile looks like this, where you've got time on this axis and production on this axis. For these shale wells, they come on like this. So they come on super high, and then they're done. Okay, so even, I mean, within 6 months, you're at 50% of what you used to make. And in about 6 to 7 years, you're done.
Okay. Okay, clear. Okay. Thank you,
All right.
Ali.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Mas Kartiko. Next question from Bang Julianta. Yeah.
Thank you, Bang Ricky.
Yeah.
Ali, this is a nice presentation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have my question in chat. So, number one, so based on your experience,
Yes, sir.
what is the most top three that need to be considered for shale reservoir?
The top three what?
The top three that need to be considered for successful to develop a shale reservoir. I mean, in terms of the, for example, geomechanics number one. This is the most critical.
Yeah,
Or number two, or the Kerogen type, something like that.
exactly. I would say, yeah, number one, I would say would be, you're absolutely correct. It would not be TOC, but the Kerogen type. It has to be the right TOC. Okay.
Okay.
Then you need to have the right type of fractures that are in there. When I say right type of fractures, there are certain fractures that are, for example, in the Permian Basin, we have these things called beef fractures. These are these vertical fractures that are calcite filled. Now, when you look at them in core, they look like they're closed, which means the fracture has a fill. But when you hydraulically fracture them, they actually come apart. Okay, so you need to have the right type of fractures. That is very important. And then the third one, in fact, the third one, and it's just as equally important as the other two, is the clay content. I've said this before. Clay is a deal breaker for these unconventional resource plays. And I would say that once when you are getting close to 40% clay, it's game over. In fact, a lot of these guys that work, the operations guys that work with the clay, with these resource plays, will tell you that even when you're getting over 20% clay, you know, you're going to start running into problems for multiple reasons. So clay is definitely a deal breaker.
Okay, so Kerogen type, fracture orientation, and then the clay type.
And the third is clay, the clay percentage.
The clay percentage.
Yep.
Okay. Excellent. And number two, my question is, you mentioned before that RC equation cannot accommodate. So from the petrophysics point of view, what's the lesson learned from the shale reservoir that need to be considered?
You know, that is an excellent question. Unfortunately, I know very little about petrophysics, and I cannot answer that for you, but I know someone who can. So if you give me just 2 minutes, I can, I think his name is Michael Holmes. And he is the shale petrophysics guru. Let me see if I can find something by him for you. There we go. All right, so this is the guy. Okay, let me see if I can paste this link for you guys over here. He is, like I said, he is the man for shale petrophysics. He's the world expert, and he puts out a lot of publications. In fact, he even has an online course on shale petrophysics. Okay, you can access that, but there's a website called Knowledge@. Okay, in fact, pretty sure we can find that one here as well. Let me see. It is Michael Holmes. There you go. So I'm going to put that link for you as well. So I would strongly recommend going and looking at the stuff that he's doing. And he gets into all the details of what the best practices are for petrophysics when it comes to shale.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Ali.
You're very welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bang Julianta. I think next question from Pak Win, yeah. Pak Win, you can turn on your mic.
Hi, Win Gajkowski here. Hey, it's a great talk. Very
thank you.
learned a lot, and it's one of the reasons I try to keep up with these youngsters at FOSI, because they keep bringing on all these very interesting speakers who are changing our minds about what shale even looks like. Oh man, that's. Hey, look, I had this thing rattling around in my head, and I'm trying to remember. There's this concept. I think that there are these things called super source rocks.
Right.
So I guess Rich is the Bakken was considered a super.
Exactly. Yep. So you've brought up a very good point right there. So the Bakken is the source rocks for the entire Williston Basin, and when we're talking about the Bakken, even the lowest TOC values in the Bakken are around 14% TOC, and it actually goes all the way up to 21% TOC. So it's ridiculously high TOC. It's the right type of TOC. So a lot of the folks that started producing the Bakken were like, okay, let's just drill horizontal wells into the Bakken, and guess what happened? It didn't work. It didn't work, and the reason it didn't work is because even though it has the high TOC, it has the right TOC, it is so clay rich that you just couldn't fracture it.
I'll be darned.
Yeah.
Well,
so
I have to admit, when I went to school, let's see, you went to school in the Cretaceous, so I was probably in this. I was there in the Silurian. I remember I had a petroleum geology course, and basically we were talking about plays, and I remember the professor kind of waving his hand over the top of the Williston, saying, "Well, they know the Williston, and there's a heck of a lot of Bakken, but kind of write it off." And I thought, well, maybe someday they'll figure out how to pull it out of the Bakken. But
yes, so they are working on the Bakken. So the Bakken is, let me just draw it for you real quick. So the way the Bakken works is you've got the Bakken, there's an upper Bakken shale, then there's a middle Bakken carbonate, and it's actually mixed carbonate siliciclastic, and then oops, wrong one. And then we've got the lower Bakken shale. So now what they're doing is they are actually drilling wells into the middle Bakken, and they were doing fantastic with that. You still have to frack it, and so that is actually working out super well. And it's a hybrid. It is still an unconventional resource play. It's hybrid. It's super tight. We're still talking about porosities less than 10%. Permeability in the nanodarcy range. So they go ahead and frack it, but when they try to land wells in the shales, that didn't work.
Huh.
Yeah, so they've made tons of oil from the middle Bakken. In fact, there's an other carbonate mud rock right underneath this called the Three Forks. Again, it has porosity in the nanodarcy, it's permeability in the nanodarcy range. It has these micropores that you can't even see those pores underneath a microscope. You have to look at it under SEM, and then it's intercrystalline porosity in these Dola mudstones. So they're producing oil from the Three Forks as well. You can go ahead and frack it, and that'll produce. But again, just the shale is so clay rich that doesn't work.
Lot of fun. Thank you very much. Good talk.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next question. I think this is the last, yeah. From Jun Rial, yeah. Okay. Jun Rial, you can turn on your mic, please.
Thank you, Ali.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to know that, but I'm not sure that you ever worked in Indonesia before or not. But I just want to know that if we want to produce the oil or shale gas in Indonesia, how long we can prepare all the equipment, the material, or even the knowledge, and how about the cost to produce the shale oil or shale oil in Indonesia? Thank you.
You know, there's a few different parts to that question. I think the very first thing you need to do is, again, you need to talk to the right experts, in the sense of, well, the first thing that needs to be done is an evaluation of the unconventional resource play that you have in mind. Okay, so for that, samples would need to be collected, core would need to be described. Now that is still, you know, that would probably take at best maybe 6 months to a year for all the samples to be evaluated, all the different geochemical tests to be done. If you've got core, that would be ideal, because unfortunately a lot of these borehole image logs like FMI or OBMI, they show the fractures, but it's very difficult to differentiate between shear versus tensional fractures and things like that. So it's best to do the fracture work on the core. So assuming someone flies to Indonesia, they describe the shale core, 6 months to a year at best for that. And then you'll know for sure, should we be investing in bringing in, you know, for example, pumps for hydraulic fracturing, and the drilling rigs that can drill horizontal wells and things like that. So I think the first part is actually much more critical, because the second part is super fast, because I know for a fact that they've got a whole bunch of unconventional resource plays that are being developed in China. There's unconventional resource plays that are being developed in the Middle East. There's a lot of activity on the Dayab Shale, which is in the United Arab Emirates. So for a company like Weatherford or Schlumberger to bring their equipment from one of those countries to Indonesia, that is not the hard part. I don't think that's going to take too long. I think the challenge is going to be just making sure that it's worth investing in bringing all that equipment and drilling your first few wells. And remember, again, I recommend, instead of drilling your first horizontal well, I would strongly recommend drilling at least 5 vertical wells to test your shale potential, because there's quite a bit of diversity in facies and fracture types going from the margins of a basin to the center of a basin.
Thank you very much, Ali. That was insightful presentations. Learned a lot about this shale play, because in Indonesia we are starting for it. So maybe we will have another successful exploration for this one in the future. So thank you very much for your time. And yeah, of course, we will again to invite you for another FOSI sharing session. So if you don't mind.
Much. Yeah. No, not at all.
All right. Thank you very much for your time, and to all participants, thank you very much for your time as well to hear the presentation. And don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel as well.
Yeah.
And see you again in the next session. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
All right. Thank you so much.
See you
Terima
all.
kasih.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.